Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today for a presentation of data from Nonprofit Finance Fund's State of the Nonprofit Sector Survey. This webinar presentation is made possible by a collaborative of organizations that includes Asian Pacific Community Fund, the California Wellness Foundation, CAUSE, APIP, AAPI Data, and Southern California Grantmakers. NFF was approached by this collaborative last year as we were preparing for our nationwide State of the Nonprofit Sector survey because they were interested in finding out the state of AAPI nonprofits in California and how they were faring compared to other nonprofits in the sector. We want to thank this group for the opportunity to do this analysis and to be able to share our findings with all of you today. My name is Tessa Borelli. I am a manager in the Knowledge and Communications Department at Nonprofit Finance Fund, and I'll be presenting today along with my colleague Jung-In So and some very special guest speakers. Jung-In, over to you.
Thank you, Tessa. So next slide. So again, my name is Jung-In. I'm the survey specialist here at Nonprofit Finance Fund. I won't be going into the agenda for today into too much detail, but basically what we're going to do today is just share with you all how we did the survey, what we found out about AAPI nonprofits in California, and provide some recommendations as well. As Tessa said, we also have two very special guest speakers today who are going to offer their response on the survey findings from the nonprofit perspective. So the first speaker that we have today is Manju Kulkarni. She's the Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. And then we will have Vivian Long, who is the Director of Programs for the Long Family Foundation. So I just want to note that the question and answer section will be at the end of the presentation, but if you have any questions during the webinar, before we get to that question portion, you can just go ahead and type in your questions in the question box that should be on in the menu.
Thanks. And then we also wanted to mention that the PDF of our presentation today is available as a handout. So you can click on the little handout window in your dashboard and download the PDF. And it will also be available to you through a couple of websites that we'll share with you at the end of the presentation. First, I wanted to share a little bit about Nonprofit Finance Fund and what we do. We essentially do three things in the social sector. We provide loans and other financing to mission-driven organizations, primarily nonprofits. We provide consulting services to nonprofits and their funders to help connect resources to the mission outcomes that they're working toward. And we help develop and share ideas and data that help advance the field's ability to tackle big and often entrenched social challenges. The survey is a pillar of our mission commitment to create, distill, and share accessible knowledge that helps mission-driven organizations help more people and communities. We wanted to also share with you a little bit more about the State of the Nonprofit Sector survey. The survey, as you can see, was launched in 2009, and it was launched because we felt that there was a need for more and better social sector data. We needed it in the Great Recession to ground anecdotes about how nonprofits were impacted by the recession. And we need it even more today. This is a very data-driven world, and there's very little real-time collective data on the nonprofit sector. So again, our goal and our hope with the survey was to ground anecdotes, particularly in this very tumultuous time. 2017 was quite a year for the sector and for the country. And we make this data available for free. We want it to be widely used. And so it's on our website. We have an analyzer that allows everybody to filter by subsector, organizational size, geography. And you can even download customized graphs. So we'll get back to that later in the presentation, but just wanted to share with you that the survey itself, it really has become not only a source of data, but also a community organizing effort as well. We work with quite a lot of partners to get a wide reach, to maximize our sample and to really ultimately lift up the voices of nonprofit leaders who are working so hard.
Okay, so to get the survey results for AAPI-serving nonprofits, what we did was set a threshold of the percentage of AAPI clients served. So basically, nonprofits had to serve at least 15% of clients that made up an AAPI group. So another condition that the nonprofits had to meet was that they have to make providing culturally or linguistically appropriate services to their AAPI clients a priority. So once we classified the survey respondents as AAPI serving nonprofits or not, we made 3 comparisons, which you can see here, with a focus on California. So we looked at how AAPI and non-AAPI nonprofits in California compared, how AAPI nonprofits with leadership challenges are different from those without, and finally, how AAPI nonprofits in LA County and the Bay Area compare. So I will just take a moment now to mention also that we did analyze results for multiple percentage thresholds, and we found that for the most part, even AAPI nonprofits that serve 50% or more AAPI clients had similar stories as those serving at least 15%. So, but there are some notable differences between the 50% and 15% threshold groups, which we've highlighted throughout the presentation. But overall, I think because we didn't see that many differences, it just strengthens the feeling that AAPI nonprofits are just in it together.
Great.
Okay, and then, so we're going to start with the first set of comparisons by looking at AAPI nonprofits and non-AAPI nonprofits in California. So this slide is just giving you a sense of the representation of AAPI nonprofits and non-AAPI nonprofits in terms of their key areas of work or their focus areas. So you can see that we had a particularly strong response rate for human services organizations, as well as arts and culture and health organizations. Where AAPI nonprofits in California stand out, though, is that they have higher responses in the civil rights and human services key areas of work. On the other hand, there are fewer education nonprofits among the responding AAPI nonprofits. For the most part, though, looking at the other key areas of work, the representation is generally similar when we're looking at AAPI nonprofits and non-AAPIs, and they're also similar to national results.
Thanks, Jung-In. So the survey itself is comprised of over 45 questions, maybe near 50 questions or so. And one of the things that we do when we first start to comb through the data and look at what the results are telling us is come up with a couple of key headlines. What are the really big stories and big themes that we're seeing in the data? And what we saw when we were looking at AAPI analysis is that chronic challenges are continuing. Demand is continuing to rise. There is an ongoing need for unrestricted funding. And it's challenging having enough hands to do all the work and paying people enough to attract them to these jobs and then to keep people at these jobs. So we also saw that AAPI nonprofits were affected by real-time concerns. Again, 2017 was a year of a lot of uncertainty. We took a look at the impact of federal policies and positions. And we saw that despite all of this, people and organizations kept stepping up, even in the face of these chronic and new challenges. And people kept finding new and better ways to drive change and expand opportunity. So I just wanted to share that our team, we all take a close look at the data, and all of us were really struck by the forward motion that was captured by plans for the future. We were very struck by the resilience, financial and otherwise, that leaders are demonstrating. We were also really aware of how critical staff are to the whole picture. And we heard in not just data points, but also in some of the qualitative responses, some of the stories and the quotes that people shared in the survey, this intense worry about the vulnerable people in the communities that we all serve. Taking a closer look at demand, what we see is that demand is rising faster than nonprofits' ability to meet it. And I will share that at the national level, this pattern goes back over the years. Since we first launched the survey back in 2009, nonprofit leaders have always reported an increase in demand and an inability to keep up with that demand. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide, this is one place where we wanted to lift up a notable difference in the threshold between 15%, which we used for the presentation, and then 50%, 50, which we also looked at. And you can see that among AAPI nonprofits that are serving 50% or more AAPI clients, only 38% anticipated being able to meet demand in 2018. And the picture that this shares with us, what this illuminates, is that there are a lot of people who are going without their basic needs met. We also ask nonprofit leaders to share with us what they see as the most critical community needs. And what you can see on this chart at the top is that affordable housing rose to the top and rose quite far beyond many of the other categories. I think in this instance, coming in second is youth programs and services. On the affordable housing data point, I wanted to share that that was cited as a critical challenge nationally as well in urban, suburban, rural communities across 48 states. And what we saw as we kept slicing and dicing the data that was that affordable housing was just in a very shared and again entrenched national issue that kept coming up no matter how we were analyzing our results. And again, in the case of AAPI nonprofits in California, you can see what an acute need this is. As I mentioned, part of the survey is raising voices, and people who took the survey were so generous to take the time to respond to some of our open-ended questions and share in their own voices some of what they're seeing with their clients and in their communities and through their work. So we have a couple of quotes that we lifted up, and there are many more, but this is a quote from an AAPI respondent who is the leader of a youth nonprofit. So I just wanted to pause for a moment so that you can read this and hear in somebody's voice. And with that, I will pass things back over to Jung-In.
Okay, thanks. So let's switch gears a little bit now and turn to some of the operational and financial challenges that are facing AAPI nonprofits in California. So we ask several questions to get a snapshot of organizational financial health. And one that we asked is shown here, which is, what are your organization's top 3 operational financial challenges? So the top 2 most cited among AAPI nonprofits are achieving long-term financial sustainability and raising funds that cover full costs. So both of these challenges were picked by 71% of responding AAPI nonprofits in California. And then raising unrestricted revenue was another top financial concern. So taken together, these financial challenges just suggest that AAPI nonprofits might have more difficulties covering all the costs needed to do what their communities need them to do. And proportionally, when you're comparing the AAPI and non-AAPI nonprofits, there's more AAPIs that are having these difficulties. So we're also encouraged by funders who get how important providing full cost and unrestricted revenue are, but these numbers are just showing that we still got a long way to go. Okay, so these are a couple more financial health indicators that we look at to understand just how nonprofits are doing. So for months of cash on hand, we can see that AAPI organizations in California are trailing a little bit behind the non-AAPIs, especially when you look at the 6 or more months of cash on hand category. But we're really happy to see just how many organizations are reporting that they finished 2017 with a surplus. So even though there are challenges in the financial environment, we are seeing that, again, you're rising to the challenges. 3/4 of you finished 2017 at break even or better. Okay. Another important part of the survey is just shining a light on funding practices so we can better understand where gaps are and what nonprofits need to deliver results. So a couple slides ago, we saw that AAPI nonprofits in California have financial challenges around sustainability, full costs, and unrestricted revenue. But we can also look more closely at specific revenue streams. So here we see that more AAPI nonprofits feel that they are often underfunded by government, or they're often underfunded by foundation grants compared to non-AAPI nonprofits. And this is one area when we look at AAPI nonprofits whose clients are at least half AAPI, the percentage of respondents saying that they feel often underfunded either by government or foundations actually goes up, suggesting that AAPI nonprofits with mostly AAPI clients are having greater financial challenges in these respects. Okay, and as Tessa mentioned, 2017 was a very tumultuous year. It was unprecedented for the nonprofit sector and the country, with racial divides just being ripped open more and more. So we wanted to ask nonprofits how federal policies and positions were impacting them as well as their clients' lives. So as you can see here, 2/3 or more of AAPI nonprofits said that the policy environment and the challenges facing their clients were harder. And more AAPI nonprofits also said that delivering on their mission was harder in 2017 compared to non-AAPI nonprofits. This is part of the national picture as well, where we saw nonprofits saying that this year was harder, that the policy environment and challenges facing their clients were harder because of federal policies and positions. And in the open-ended responses that Tessa mentioned, we saw a lot of deep concerns about not just immigrants and people of color, but other communities like the LGBTQ community, the elderly, and low-income people as well. Okay, so we also mentioned already that AAPI nonprofits that are facing staffing challenges as well. Human capital is very important, as you all know. So there is a huge need to invest in the human capital of our sector generally, and it's especially true for AAPI nonprofits. So these 3 challenges here, the 3 staffing challenges, are the most cited by AAPI nonprofits in California. So the top staffing challenge by more than 10 percentage points is offering competitive pay to staff members. Another challenge is just employing enough hands to do all of the work that you need to do. And then rounding out the top 3 is identifying, recruiting, or retaining staff who are able to provide the linguistic and culturally appropriate services that your clients need. And you can also see that some of these staffing challenges hit the AAPI nonprofits harder compared to non-AAPIs. And then just to highlight, some of these staffing challenges, we have a quote here from a leader of an AAPI human services nonprofit. And I just wanted to mention my own experience working at a Korean nonprofit where that was also a human services organization. Basically, it was so challenging to find staff who could work both in the American culture that we were operating in, as well as the Korean culture of the people that we were serving. So we had to keep one foot in both worlds, and it can be hard and challenging to find staff who can do that. And I'm sure that you all have similar experiences to this leader's and my own. But I will just pause a moment so we all have a chance to read this and then pass things back to Tessa.
Thanks, Jung-in. So as I mentioned, we were very inspired to see all of the forward motion reflected in the data. And this graph takes a look at actions taken in 2017. And notably, what we saw is that a lot of organizations are collaborating and partnering with others. We saw that leaders are finding ways to invest in their staff to bring on more people, and that speaks to how much of a priority people and staff are. And we saw that leaders are finding ways to expand programs and services and to continue to meet rising demand. So this, I think, again, speaks to just the tenacity that we often see in the nonprofit sector. So we were really struck by, again, the number of people who mentioned collaborating and partnering with another organization. So what we were curious to explore with everybody on the line today is how many of you are, so you're going to see a poll come up in just a second, and if your organization is using or exploring a partnership, we were just curious what kind. So you should see a poll, and please feel free to just look through these options and consider again if this is something that has been a strategy at your nonprofit, which of these speaks to the type of collaboration or partnership that your nonprofit is exploring right now. So I'll leave this open for a couple more seconds. We've got votes coming in. And it looks like we've got a couple, we've got some across the board so far. So I'll leave this open 5 more seconds so you all can get your votes in. Great. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close so that you can all see. And I think what you should all be able to see, we saw that 50% are looking at collaborations, 25% strategic alliances, 10% integration, 15% funding alliances, and nobody marked cost sharing. I also recognize that there might be, you might be doing a couple of these, they might overlap. So the poll might not fully reflect the scope of your partnerships and collaborations, but we just wanted to get a quick pulse in the room. So thank you all for participating in that. So going back to our results and taking a look at what we saw with our AAPI nonprofit analysis, we wanted to ask this year a couple of questions to gather data on organizational diversity. And so we asked about among executive directors, CEO, managing director levels, how many were people of color and how many were community members. We also asked similar questions among the composition of board and senior leaders. And as you can see on these graphs, that AAPI nonprofits are leading when it comes to having people of color and community members represented in senior leadership roles. We also took a look at outcomes measurement practices and how organizations are measuring what works. And in general, we've been seeing a shift in the social sector toward outcomes-based funding models, particularly in the health and human services sectors. So AAPI nonprofits reported receiving funding tied to outcomes at a higher rate than non-AAPI orgs. And in general, we saw that a lot of organizations were quite far along the continuum of impact measurement and outcomes-related activities. This is an area of focus for us at NFF because we see that all too often funding incentivizes a short-term focus on outputs. So for example, a shelter might be funded on the number of beds filled per night rather than an outcome like the number of people who transition to permanent housing. So our hope and our belief is that funding systems need to change so that nonprofits can achieve long-term progress. Reflecting on data more broadly, this was another quote that was shared with us that I wanted to share with all of you. And I think to me, this speaks to how important data is to just lift up the reality of our communities, what's happening, and just shine lights where data is needed and where data can be helpful. And with that, I'm going to pass things back over to Jung-In.
Okay, thanks. So in this section, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to be looking at the next two comparison groups that we analyzed. So the first is going to be AAPI nonprofits with leadership challenges, and then the second set of comparisons will be AAPI nonprofits in LA County and the Bay Area. Okay, so in this deeper dive section of leadership challenges, we looked at AAPI nonprofits that said that they had two specific challenges. The first is identifying the next generation of leadership, and the second challenge we looked at is recruiting and or retaining staff with leadership potential. So there are roughly similar percentages of both AAPI and non-AAPI nonprofits in California that said they had either of these two leadership challenges. But we did see that there were some differences between AAPI nonprofits that did or didn't have either of these challenges. So basically, we see that AAPI nonprofits in California that had one of the two leadership challenges showed fewer signs of growth, or they struggled with full or timely funding. Okay, so next. Yeah, so to get into the fewer signs of growth, this slide shows the results for AAPI nonprofits that have the leadership challenge of struggling to recruit and or retain staff with leadership potential. So basically, fewer of these organizations said that they were planning to increase staff, more were planning to reduce programs, and fewer said that they were going to be meeting demand in the next year in comparison to those AAPI nonprofits that didn't have the specific leadership challenge. So Tessa explained earlier how among AAPI nonprofits and as well as nationally, that demand just keeps increasing faster than organizations can meet it. So among AAPI nonprofits who are struggling to recruit or retain staff with leadership potential, there could be, extra challenges in meeting the growing demand for services. We also saw that AAPI nonprofits that said they were struggling with the other leadership challenge of identifying the next generation of leadership. They also showed fewer signs of growth in terms of the actions that they took in 2017. And this is also one area where we saw more challenges among AAPI nonprofits that have that have 50% or more AAPI clients. So basically, we saw those organizations saying that they took actions like reducing staff or staff pay more so compared to the AAPI nonprofits without that challenge. Okay, next. Okay, so this slide shows that AAPI nonprofits with leadership challenges also have some challenges around the themes of funding for full costs as well as a reliable cash flow. So when we look at AAPI nonprofits that said that they have trouble identifying the next generation of leadership, we see these two themes coming out in terms of more saying that a top financial challenge is raising funds to cover full costs, and more also said that having regular, reliable cash flow is also a top financial challenge. And then if we look at AAPI nonprofits that said struggling to recruit or retain staff with leadership potential. The themes of full cost and reliable funding come out in terms of, again, that top financial challenge of having regular, reliable cash flow. But then we also see that more AAPI nonprofits with this specific leadership challenge more said that they were often underfunded by government compared to those without this challenge. So what we're seeing, basically to sum up these findings, is a common theme among AAPI nonprofits with leadership challenges, that they're struggling with fuller, reliable funding, as well as the fewer signs of growth that we saw previously. Okay, and then here is another quote. It again just speaks to the importance of having full costs. This is another leader of a AAPI Human Services nonprofit. Again, I'll just pause so you can read it, and then we'll look to the LA County and Bay Area comparison next with Tessa.
Thanks, Jung-In. So we also had a chance to, as Jung-In mentioned, and as we said earlier, take a look to compare LA County AAPI nonprofits with those in the Bay Area. And when we took a look and made this comparison, there were two themes that emerged that demonstrated that AAPI nonprofits in LA had slightly bigger challenges than their counterparts in the Bay Area, and those themes were financial health overall and funding full costs. So we're going to take a closer look at each of these themes. Taking a look first at financial health, we look at a couple of different indicators when we're assessing how nonprofits are doing, from this 1,000-foot view. And as you can see here, some of the indicators that we've lifted up: operating results, months of cash on hand, regular, reliable cash flow. You'll see a difference in how organizations in LA are faring compared to those in the Bay Area. So I think even just focusing on the very first bullet, that 33% of AAPI nonprofits in LA ended fiscal year 17 with a deficit versus 11% in the Bay Area. So I won't read through all of these, but I think it demonstrates a slightly bigger challenge that is important to recognize regionally. We also looked at funding for full costs. This is something that we think and talk a lot about at NFF. And what we saw here is that there's a similar disparity. So we saw that LA AAPI nonprofits felt underfunded by government more so than their Bay Area counterparts. Fewer felt comfortable talking about true costs with funders. And raising unrestricted revenue was a bigger challenge. 56% said it was a top operational and financial concern versus 48% of those in the Bay Area. This is another slide where we wanted to lift up this threshold difference when we looked at AAPI nonprofits in LA that are serving 50% or more AAPI clients. 64% said that raising unrestricted revenue is a top operational and financial concern. So I realize we were throwing around a lot of percentages, but I think that the takeaway is just we're looking at the overall picture and what are some of the struggles and where are some of these struggles more pronounced. And it was an interesting data slice to compare Bay Area to Los Angeles. And I think also that, while we're looking at these differences overall, the data speaks to challenges and experiences that are shared. So it's not to say that there are not struggles in the Bay Area. There certainly are, but we're just seeing some of these present in a more acute way in Los Angeles through our data. we also wanted to lift up for you a slide that compares outcomes-based practices among Los Angeles and Bay Area AAPI nonprofits. And on this front, it's worth pointing out that organizations in LA are leading in terms of either receiving or pursuing outcomes-based funding. So we just thought that was an interesting trend and something that we'll be curious to watch and see how that unfolds over time. So at this point, we would actually like to bring in some new voices and transition, and I am absolutely thrilled to introduce to you a speaker that we mentioned earlier, Manju Kulkarni, who is going to share with us some thoughts and reflections from her experience having been an executive director at the South Asian Network for a long period of time, and now in her current role as the executive director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. So Manju, I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Tessa. Good morning, everyone. Before I start, I want to thank California Wellness Foundation, Southern California Grantmakers, Asian Pacific Community Fund, the Nonprofit Finance Fund, CAUSE, APIP, and AAPI Data for hosting this important webinar, and specifically to Deborah Fung for inviting me to share my insights. As Tessa mentioned, today I will be speaking from my experience at APCON and also at South Asian Network. For those who don't know, APCON is a coalition of 40-plus community-based organizations that serve and represent the 1.5 million Asian Pacific Islanders in Los Angeles County, roughly 15% of the community, or 15% of the total population of Los Angeles County. And our member organizations serve East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, and Pacific Islander communities and provide direct services, conduct policy advocacy and civic engagement, and develop leadership among our community members. SAN is one of our members, and as Tessa said, my former organization. I mention that too because much of what I'll be saying today applies specifically to some of the experiences of South Asian communities, but I'm not trying to necessarily just privilege South Asians or South Asian American experiences. So turning to the survey results, it's no secret that running a nonprofit in Southern California is difficult, and the survey data indicate that operating an Asian Pacific Islander community-based organization is extremely demanding. Why? In addition to issues impacting all communities, including poverty and violence, API community-based organizations have to address language and cultural issues that are different than that of the dominant culture. In API communities, we need to be responsive to the numerous language needs of the community. For example, at South Asian Network, we provided services in 5 languages that were predominantly spoken by community members in need. Those were Hindi, Urdu, Bangla, Punjabi, and Gujarati. And as Jung In mentioned, there's also the need to know and understand English as well, and that constant code switching that our organizations have to do. Additionally, API communities are geographically dispersed. We know, for example, that not all Koreans are in Koreatown. Bangladeshis, we know, are in Koreatown in large numbers, but also in Walnut and Diamond Bar. Additionally, much of the outreach work that's done by API community-based organizations happens at faith centers, and for a number of API communities, that involves really going to different types of religious institutions. At SAN, in addition to going to churches, we also went to Hindu temples, to mosques, and to gurudwaras to do our outreach work. And as was mentioned before, there have been new challenges brought on by some of the anti-immigrant rhetoric and xenophobic policies of the current federal administration. We know many of you submitted comments yesterday, as we did, regarding the expansion of public charge. And so these are new challenges that we certainly didn't expect a few years back, and are having significant detrimental effects on our community members. In addition, the survey results show a lack of financial stability and sustainability. And why is that? We know that traditional fundraising models often do not work for API communities and also perhaps for other communities of color. Some API communities, for example, have very limited resources. According to the Color of Wealth report provided by the Federal Reserve Bank in 2016, the median assets in LA County of whites was $355,000, while that of Vietnamese Americans in LA was only $40,000, and Koreans even lower at $28,000. So, of course, that's going to have significant impact on who can give to our nonprofits. Additionally, there may be no culture of giving in certain communities, or charitable giving goes primarily to religious institutions. According to CCF, that is California Community Foundation's Generosity Gap report in 2016, we found that APIs in Los Angeles generally give very little to organizations that provide for basic needs or human services, but they give quite a bit more toward faith center and religious institutions. Additionally, in some cases, even those individuals with resources in our communities do not necessarily give to ethnic-specific organizations, but instead to their local schools, to their YMCA, or organizations and nonprofits that serve mainstream communities. Moving on, the second major finding of the survey involves, of course, those concerns regarding staffing and leadership gaps. Why do we see those? Well, it's often difficult for API executive directors to find staff who understand the community and speak the language. Young people in our communities do not necessarily pursue careers in nonprofits. In fact, sometimes we see that they're discouraged or not encouraged by family members. In my own experience, I can tell you early on, being a nonprofit health lawyer was akin to being a professional juggler. Literally, people in my extended family understood that I had some training and talent, but really didn't know what the purpose I was serving in my career. Additionally, we know that nonprofit careers for our community members really can lack prestige and lack financial stability or security that's sought by API families and API parents, to be sure. Related to that is, of course, the issue of leadership positions. And we know that at a number of our organizations and the community overall, there's not necessarily a pipeline to lead to those leadership positions, and that there are few resources for succession planning. So as I conclude, I have three main takeaways from the wonderful survey that's been done by Nonprofit Finance Fund with the help of Asian Pacific Community Fund and other organizations. That is that more resources are needed because running an API community-based organization is, in fact, a heavier lift. Resources are needed for hiring and retention of staff and recruiting and training for leadership positions within API organizations. And finally, a full cost framework is absolutely critical to pay for additional staffing, skills, and needs of the community. And as we move into 2019, I did want to just share with you that APCON and our coalition is working to do some of those things, which is to secure more financial resources for our member organizations, including through some of our issue-specific collaboratives, domestic violence, civic engagement, mental health services. Additionally, we're increasing capacity of the staff of member organizations to meet the needs of the community through trainings and workshops. And finally, trying to develop a leadership pipeline through programs like AAPI-Civic University and programs with local universities to help encourage young people who are at UCLA, USC, our Cal States, as well as our community colleges to consider a career in the nonprofit world, which we know actually is something that's quite wonderful and really provides so much contribution to our communities that is much needed. So I want to thank you again for the opportunity to share my thoughts. And again, thank you for this wonderful data that's really important for all of our communities, our funders, and government to understand about our community.
Thank you so much, Manju, for your reflections and for joining us and being part of this presentation. And we are also absolutely thrilled to have Vivian Long with us. She's, as Jungin mentioned, the Director of Programs for the Long Family Foundation and brings a philanthropic perspective from the nonprofit sector as well. So Vivian, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tessa. Good morning, everybody. I'm so thankful to be on the call with all of you, and want to first just start off also by saying thanks so much to the Nonprofit Finance Fund for putting this research together. I think it's a really great snapshot of where the AAPI community is right now, especially in comparison to the non-AAPI community. And I also just want to thank everyone on the call. I know each and every one of you are really on the ground doing work in your communities, and just so grateful because it's really what you guys are doing, often underthanked and underpaid, as we've just heard, but you're really providing those critical services to our community members. So thank you for that. So the Long Family Foundation is a private foundation founded in 1992 by my parents, John and Marilyn. Our 4 pillars are to support religious, educational, cultural, and research endeavors. And since I joined full-time with the foundation about 2 years ago, I've really had a commitment to deepening our engagement with the AAPI community. My major observation over the past 2 years, and I think highlighted today, is that this community is just vastly underfunded. Sue Van, who has been a wonderful friend and inspiration to me as an Asian American funder, shares the statistic quite frequently from an APIP study that Asian American nonprofits receive less than 0.4% of foundation funding. So when we were looking at this this presentation, I think that feeling from nonprofits that they're underfunded is actually very real. And you know, in addition, there's a feeling of being underfunded by the government, which is why I think this 2020 census is so critical for so many reasons, but that representation of our Asian American community, we need to increase our foundation funding, but we really need to ensure that we're represented at a state, at a federal, at a local level as well to ensure that we receive funding that way. So given that we are an underfunded community, I have 3 kind of sub-observations that go alongside what we've learned today. One is that collaboration is growing, but still low and lacks strategy. So I think that slide that was up earlier was really encouraging to show that more nonprofits are collaborating, but it's still relatively low when it comes to integration or to strategic planning. And I think one way to think about that is also by looking at the slide that shows the number of nonprofit organizations dedicated to each category. So we have arts and culture, education, so forth and so on. But how does that compare to the dollars that are coming in? So if we have a lot of organizations that are in one space, but there aren't a lot of dollars there, then we end up with many organizations that are really running on shoestring budgets, that are challenged, lack resources. And so how are we thinking about how we're supporting each other? And I think funders are partially to blame for this environment that we've created of competition. You know, for too long, I think funders have really kind of scattered crumbs and forced nonprofits to really fight over it. So as funders, I think we really are thinking about how do we change the strategy and really encourage these nonprofits not just to collaborate, but to think about long-term strategic partnerships that are going to really sustain the programs that are being done, the services that are being provided to the community. The second observation I have is about cultivation and support for young leaders. And I know Manju just talked about this as well and couldn't agree more with everything that she said. I think it's abundantly clear that young leaders are challenged in this area for a lot of reasons. I think the cultural highlight is very important to say that a lot of young Asian Americans weren't encouraged to go into public service, whether that means government, whether that means nonprofit. And so how are we really ensuring now that we're cultivating those young leaders? One is that, we need to start paying them what they deserve to be paid. So as funders, how are we really supporting that? But to switch gears a little bit, I think the other important young leaders that we really need to think about are our young funders. And how are our nonprofits, how are we bringing in a younger generation of supporters, of board members, of people who are going to grow alongside the organization into a new era? So I think for one suggestion I would have for nonprofits, if I may, is to really think about the composition of your board and look at the age of the people that you have. One, if you don't have term limits, it would be something that I would suggest you consider. But more importantly, how are you bringing on young people? Now, they may not be able to come in with as much funding as some of your legacy board members, but having their input at the table, I think is really critical. And additionally, they're going to be with you hopefully through the lifetime of the organization. And it's an education opportunity for young people who have not had the chance to sit on a board as well. So I think there can be a little bit of mutual education happening at the same time. And the last thing I would say is an observation kind of as I've been trying to figure out how to approach the census. So I'm sure all of the nonprofits are working on their census strategy. But one thing that I've been hearing a lot is that nonprofits felt somewhat ready for the 2010 census, and there's a sense that there's less readiness for the 2020 census. And that's for a number of reasons. One is that we're in a much different political climate. The rhetoric around the census has changed. We're contesting the citizenship question. But I think asking our nonprofits, what's your readiness for the next era, the next decade of what's to come, is a very real question. And so that goes along with, are we making sure we have young board members that are going to help us? Are we making sure that the people that we're hiring are really competent in the skills that are needed now? I mean, having people who are competent in social media is something that I would argue is quite important as we enter 2020. So I think for funders, we really need to think about how we can support these nonprofits in the work that we're doing. How are we listening to the nonprofits and their needs? I think there's a tendency to get really tied up in this idea of needing to see a certain program services ratio, funding things that are going to have outcomes, but it's important to also understand the need for unrestricted dollars or operational costs. A lot of nonprofits need to upgrade their software. They need to move to a different database. They need to get technology that's going to be able to serve their clients better. So how are we as funders really able to respond to that need? And I think one other thing that I saw was the months of cash on hand. It's great that so many nonprofits have enough cash on hand for kind of the immediate term, but that there's a big drop off after 6 months. So as funders, how can we think about entering in multi-year partnerships to really be a consistent source of support for some of these nonprofits? So the last thing I'll say is just kind of our strategy as a foundation about how we can support the Asian American community. And that's really coming from a posture of acknowledging, respecting, and honoring our cultural differences. So what makes each of our ethnic groups different, but really acknowledging that this is a time where we have to actively coalesce and achieve one voice, because without that, our groups are not going to be as strong apart as they are together. So once again, thanks so much for the opportunity to let me share my thoughts, and I'll pass it back over to Tessa.
Thank you so much, Vivian. Thank you. And again, to Manju, both of you, it's just wonderful to hear your voices and your perspectives and your thoughts and reflections. We're very grateful. With that, with all of these great thoughts in mind, one section of the survey that we've been talking a lot about and referencing is full costs and financial health. We've been talking a lot about how those two things relate. So as we move into the last part of our webinar, we wanted to share with you a couple of thoughts and ideas around how you can think about full costs and financial health day to day at your organization. So before we kick off, I was again we have a mini survey, one last poll, and would love to hear from all of you. Just an understanding of your familiarity with full cost. So the poll is now open, and if you can go ahead and just share, your comfort level, your familiarity, how much you've interfaced with this idea, that would be great. And so we've got some votes coming in, and it looks like we've got people with a great range of experience and with exposure to this. So I'm going to just leave it a couple more seconds so everybody has a chance to weigh in on this. Great. All right, and so I'm going to share our results. And I think the top one would be very. So 37% said very, 30% said somewhat, 33% not very, and that's the mix. So I'm going to go ahead and move on and just talk a little bit more about what we mean at NFF when we talk about full costs. And the first piece of this that I want to mention is that all of these components come together and provide a complete picture of what a nonprofit needs in order to be solvent and sustainable and really successful for the long term. At the same time, not all of these pieces are going to fit every organization, and they might fit for a period of time. It's a very, this is a very dynamic, moving picture. So just to kind of quickly go through each one of these expenses and what they mean and what they look like on the ground in your day-to-day, total expenses are exactly that day-to-day cost of running the business, delivering programs. And when we think about total expenses, we also delineate between operating, non-operating, and unfunded expenses. All of us in the nonprofit world, I think, are familiar with the things that just need to happen and need to get done in order to deliver your services that are not always paid for, unfortunately, or not yet anyway. Working capital is the dollars to cover predictable ebbs and flows in cash. This is the pot of money that's a financial cushion, and it would regularly be drawn on and replenished. Reserves are those savings set aside for a particular purpose that's usually designated by the board. And reserves can include a rainy day or a risk fund, maybe facilities for an organization that has a building. It might also be reserves for an opportunity to invest in a special project or a partnership, which we've been talking about a lot. Some folks have debt principal repayment, which is just dollars to pay down debt. We also have fixed asset additions. So this would be bringing in something new. Maybe it's a new building if an organization is expanding, new equipment like computers. And then our last category is change capital, and that is resource to invest in transformational change. That might mean moving to new geographies, significantly scaling a program, or growing a scope of services. So these top three we consider the must-haves that are pretty essential for all nonprofits. And then these bottom three are sometimes needed by some organizations and maybe at some point in the organization's life cycle. With that in mind, we want to just dig a little deeper into the unfunded expenses because this is such an important part of our thinking on full cost, and part of what we're advocating for at NFF when we talk about wanting to adjust and inform funding practices. So unfunded expenses exist for all of us. They're at every organization. The question is, to what degree has the organization been running without all the resources that are needed, specifically with staff? And I think, again, today in our presentation, we've talked a lot about how crucial having the right staff is for an organization, and keeping staff, having enough money to pay competitive wages and invest in that long-term leadership pipeline. So one of the ways that unfunded expenses can show up in our work is with sweat equity, which is just overworking and underpaying staff. And when we think back to the demand statistics that we saw from the data, this is another expression, I think, of an underfunded expense. There are just not enough hands to do the work that needs doing. And what this can also look like is just, in terms of keeping staff and avoiding that burnout. When there's an opportunity to bring in, another pair of hands so that your executive director, instead of working 60 or 80 or however many hours a week, maybe can rebalance that work distribution a little bit. So another way that unfunded expenses can show up is in not having the right supplies or enough supplies. And these are just some of the barriers, I think, that can impact the day-to-day experience of nonprofit leaders, and can get in the way of trying to do the amazing work that everybody just wants to be able to do. So one thing that is really important to note, though, is that unfunded expenses are not expenses to do more. It's to do what you're already doing in a more fair way. And that is really, really the key with advocating for more resource to fund these unfunded expenses. On this next slide, we wanted to offer a couple of these, quick pulse checks that all of you can do at your organizations. And two of these are going to be very familiar from the survey. We were just looking at data around operating surplus or deficit and months of cash. And then we also included on this pulse check months of liquid unrestricted net assets. And we find that these are certainly, again, not comprehensive, but just for a very quick temperature check on how the organization is doing, these can be really good pulse points to keep an eye on throughout the year. So with the operating surplus or deficit, what we're looking at is the organization's ability to cover operating expenses and what is the revenue that's coming from your core business model. Basically, we're really just looking at that strength of the business model. And this information is going to be on your income statement. And then we have this very quick calculation. How can you just quickly assess at a moment where your organization is? Ideally, what we're looking for, and what we were very heartened to see in the survey data, is that a lot of organizations were managing to finish the year with surpluses, and were managing to avoid unplanned deficits. So those are all strong signs of strong and stable business models. With the months of cash on hand, we look at months of cash to understand how well positioned an organization is to cover day-to-day. And we look at how much money is available relative to the size of the organization's expense budget. And so, again, we've got some indications of where you can find this information and what the quick calculation is to get that number for your organization. This last row, looking at those liquid unrestricted net assets, it's getting a little bit more specific and more particular, but it's another important gauge of how long an organization can cover short-term obligations and day-to-day expenses. And the more an organization is able to build up, unrestricted, no strings attached money, the better positioned an organization is to mitigate risks and pursue opportunities that come along. So we just wanted to, again, offer that to all of you because we've been talking so much about full costs and about financial health. And so these are some ideas, some concepts and some very practical just calculations that you can keep in mind and bring back to your organization as you're thinking about financial health long term. I'm going to go ahead and pass things back over to Jung-In.
Thank you, Tessa. So now that you all have had an introduction to what full cost means and just how to understand your organization's, financial starting point, I just want to take a little bit of time to go over the key takeaways of what we presented today. Just what exactly is the data telling us? So the first key takeaway is that AAPI nonprofits in California they have similar challenges to other nonprofits nationally, like concern for the people they serve. Again, we're seeing this like through the top need of affordable housing, which is affecting not only the clients that organizations are serving, but staff members as well. Another is that demand is rising faster than the ability to meet it. Again, this is one area where we saw even greater challenges among AAPI nonprofits that serve majority API clients. And another is funding for full costs and unrestricted revenue, which is another shared challenge among all nonprofit organizations. Okay, next slide. Okay, so all of that said, there are some challenges that are hitting AAPI nonprofits harder. So we saw this in terms of the impact of federal policies and positions affecting making the policy environment and the abilities to deliver on their mission, as well as the challenges facing their clients even harder in 2018 versus 2017. And then another area where we saw challenges hitting AAPI nonprofits is geographically, where AAPI nonprofits in LA County had more operating deficits and less cash on hand. So, Manju alluded to this a bit earlier, where in LA County it's just so diverse, and so there may be geographic or contextual differences that we need to look into in seeing like why AAPI nonprofits in LA have some more financial difficulties. And then finally, AAPI nonprofits in California that have leadership challenges are also showing fewer signs of growth and having difficulties also with fuller, timely funding. But all of that said, it's not all bad. AAPI nonprofits are still thriving. They have more diversity in terms of their organizational leadership. Many of you are also collaborating, which we also saw with the poll. But AAPI nonprofits are also thriving by growing to expand their programs, increase staff, and they're also engaging in formal advocacy. We also see that AAPI nonprofits are thriving by measuring impact and being part of an increasingly outcomes-focused sector. So basically what we're seeing is that AAPI nonprofits are bringing their determination and creativity to serving their communities. They're taking what they have and doing what they can to reach their missions. Okay, and
Thank you so much, Diane. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to pass it back on to you for questions.
Fantastic, thank you. And we did have a couple of fantastic questions come in during the webinar. So I am going to go ahead and just lift these two or three that came in, and we have a couple more that are coming in as we speak. So one of the first questions that I saw was just who are the survey respondents, who's taking the survey, and who are they representing? And that's a fabulous question. We at NFF reach out to a lot of our own lists, the contacts that we have to share the survey, and then we partner widely to get as far of a reach across the nation and into as many pockets of the social sector as we can reach. So we are, the survey is intended for nonprofit leaders and they are really asked to reflect on what they're seeing through their experience and through the services that they're offering. I think in the case of, as we saw with our AAPI analysis in California, there was a lot of community representation among leadership. So I think there was a really nice and close connection to what was happening in the community, and I think the data that we received through these respondents that we were able to take a look at. Another question that came up was just how did we define cultural opportunities? And I think that this is on the slide about community needs, where at the top was affordable housing, next was youth programs and services, and then following, not far behind that, was cultural opportunities. And I think I'll make 2 points about how we define that. I'm not sure, and Jung-In, you can correct me, if we had a very explicit definition for what we meant by cultural opportunities, and our intention was to keep it open and a little bit broad so that it could capture what we would consider just access to artistic and cultural expressions in a community, whatever that might look like. So it was meant to be an inclusive term to just really speak to, whether that is performances or places for art to be, displayed, or all of the other ways that arts and culture can be embedded and reflected in a community. And then let's see, Jung-In, over to you for our next question.
Yeah, so we had a question of just how we can use the survey data for benchmarking. We provided these sort of financial pulse points, and so just how can we benchmark our organization and see where we are? So we actually have a survey analyzer that is published online at, we'll show the URL in a little bit, actually. But it lets you view a subsample of organizations similar to yours. Basically, you can filter the national results to a specific subsector, a certain size or operating expenses for the year, and also look at other characteristics like whether your organization serves low-income communities and in what kind of city types or suburban areas does the organization serve into. So you can filter the survey results to other organizations and that meet similar characteristics as your organization, and you can look at different data points to compare. So one of the questions that we have in the survey analyzer is the average indirect government reimbursement rate at the different government levels, so for federal, state, and local. So you can just see, where your organization stands and then compare to the responses of the other organizations in the subsample that you've selected. For example, every organization has different needs for cash on hand. Some areas of work can be more expensive to provide services, and so you can see and compare results for your organization to the others.
Great. I'll go on to our next question, which is how have others used the survey to open conversations? And we've seen the survey used to ground conversations in data. So for example, increases in service demand and top community needs can sometimes be used to advocate for funding to better cover that full cost of meeting demand and responding to community need. So when we again launched it back in 2009, and we brought to light some of the figures, it's striking to hear that 79% of nonprofits say that demand for their services is increasing. It can just bring facts and figures to what otherwise can feel like an anecdotal response. So I think we also have seen a lot of these data points brought into presentations, into grant proposals and testimonies. And in another minute, I'll go over some other ways that the data can be used. Jung-In, I'll pass this next one back to you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question. The question was just, how can I share these results? So as I mentioned, we have the free online analyzer, but we also have a downloadable PDF of the national results that you can access if you go to nff.org/survey. It has high-level takeaways and themes, along with different graphs and visualizations of the data. And so you can also go to their analyzer and download charts as well that you can share.
Awesome. And so I also wanted to lift up for all of you that today's webinar and materials will be available at the websites that you see up here: apcf.org, apip.org, cause.org, socialgrantmakers.org. I'm sorry, Southern California Grantmakers. So please feel free to go to these websites as well for today's presentation and materials. And then as we wrap up, I'm going to just quickly run through some other ways that we've seen this data used. Again, for that context and benchmarking, it can be very helpful even within your own organization to talk about alignment. Some people have asked for a copy of the questions and will use it as an opening activity for a board meeting. We've seen this used for advocacy in research settings and really ultimately for communication. This is the web address that Jung-In shared, nff.org/survey data for our analyzer. So please feel free to visit that and you'll be able to take a look. And so we just want to close. I know some of you on the phone took the survey and we cannot thank you enough. We are so grateful for the opportunity to speak with all of you today and to shine a light on what we saw when we did some analysis on AAPI nonprofits in California. Thank you again to our fantastic speakers, Manju and Vivian, and to the collaborative of organizations and that just made this possible, and to our survey partners as well. So we look forward to staying connected with all of you, and thank you again for making this survey such a successful effort. Thanks so much.